government's view of the economy could be summed up in a few short phrases. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. Right now, for the Sri Lankan government, it seems that they do not know when to tax, when to regulate, and when to subsidize. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today revolves around the 2018 budget. Is it going to make you rich? And also the state of the country's economy. Right now, the country is in a limbo once again. Why? Because of petrol. In July this year, we saw the same problem. There was a petrol strike and there was again a problem. What? People in limbo. Just a few months after, again, what happens? The government tries to import substandard petrol. What happens? We are in limbo. We have a minister who apologizes to the public. Is that alone enough? What has to happen next? I recollect right in the beginning of this year, many economists and also astrologers said the year is going to be bad for Sri Lanka. It seems now 2 months more to go, just 1.5 months more to go. Is it going to transform into bad to us? To discuss all this and more, we have invited to the studios 4 eminent personalities who are affiliated to chambers as well as many organizations. Let me quickly introduce them to you. Joining us this evening for the first time on the show is Ramal Jalsingha, President of the National Chamber of Exporters. Nice to have you on board, Ramal.
Thank you.
Also joining us this evening is Subhashini Abesingha, Research Director from Verite Research. Nice to have you on board as well. Also joining us this evening is Sujiva Samarveera, President of the National Chamber of Commerce. And then Ravi Rathasabapati, Fellow, Advocata Institute. Nice to have you on board as well, Ravi. So let's start off tonight's show with the President of the National Chamber of Commerce, Sujiva Samarveera. Sujiva, the country's economy, how does it look like at the moment? What have been the grievances that have been coming out from the private sector as well as the state sector? Where are we standing right now as a country? Your time starts now.
Yeah, actually, when you look at today's economy, there are certain issues that we need to address at the moment with the government. But if you really look at the overall picture, there had been some hiccups with some of the administration issues which regard to taxes and also some of the incentives given to many business people. But if you look at the whole economy as the point of the National Chamber, we are looking forward, not actually looking backward, because we knew that there has been some changes happening in the past, but we are basically looking forward for a better economic prospects especially we are looking at the SME sector. That's our main focus, and also the local business sector. Because if you look at the National Chamber's perspective, we are mainly focusing not only the bigger companies but the middle and small level companies as well. And actually the local entrepreneurs per se. Because if you look at the start of the national economy and National Chamber, it was started in 1948 after independence to support the local industries. Of course, today we have a gamut of membership in our organization. So looking at the SME sector and also the local business sector, we have made a lot of recommendations to the government in terms of safeguarding one of the most biggest businesses happening, the entrepreneurs in Sri Lanka. If you look at the initiatives taken by the National Chamber in perspective of the economic development, we have been always advocating the fact that there should be a national trade policy, which is far most important for us to decide on various trade agreements that we sign. The second initiative that we take proudly, we can say, we brought in the anti-dumping policy to be introduced to the Sri Lankan government so that the dumping activities of many other countries can be mitigated into Sri Lanka. So looking at all those suggestions that we've made, we're looking forward for a better economic environment to play around. If you look at this local market situation, yes, we know there are certain, if you look at this, the domestic market, we see lots of prices of commodities going up, the coconut prices going up, then we have issues with diesel. Those are ongoing issues with any government will face depending on the administration of that government. But we are looking at more broader picture, looking at developing our businesses per se. Then we look at policies where we could develop, and we are looking at infrastructure development which is taking place. We are also looking very positively as Sri Lanka as an energy hub because of various.
You just mentioned about the national trade policy.
Yeah.
How far progress has been made? We know that this was a discussion that was afoot since last year.
Yes.
And the government is famous of having discussions and no implementation at all. So how far have you all progressed on this?
No, actually, the government has taken some steps towards that. We have had so many discussions, and actually now I can see a positive step of listening to us. The government is calling more oftenly to discuss the matters, and we have actually corrected some of the weak areas. Which, if you take the National Chamber's perspective, we have also told them that we must look at the previous agreement we had with the Indian government, especially looking at ICTA. And on the Chinese agreement, we have also given certain proposal which the government has taken very positively. And I think, we can say that we have been heard to a great extent, but there are certain issues that we need to settle. One or two industries that we need to look at. Footwear industry maybe it's one of the industries. We are looking at more greater into that, but generally some of the proposals we have made has been accepted by the government.
Sujiv, you say that the government needs to have a proper trade policy, and you say that the government is listening to you all and other organizations as well.
Yeah.
But when you really look at the past few months, whenever the president takes or undertakes a visit overseas, he signs a trade agreement with another country. When you see the Prime Minister going overseas, you see him signing trade agreements as well. And people don't know what these trade agreements are.
Actually, those are bilateral agreements that,
yes,
you go on a ministerial delegation, you sign basically on looking at your import and export. Those are agreements signed between the two ministerial portfolios.
Is that healthy for a country? Signing agreements, you go to a country, sign an agreement, and people don't know what the contents of these agreements are.
To that extent, now, if you look at the business people should know, definitely. But there are business delegations going with these delegations, the government. And also if you look at, I'm talking about the broader situation, like what we are going to sign with Singapore, what we are going to sign with China, India, to that extent, Singapore as well. So those are broader ways of looking at these agreements. Of course, you are talking about bilateral agreements which ministerial delegations go there and they look at the trade balances and they agree on certain trade policies where they support each other. But I don't think that it is not necessarily for the whole country to know this kind of agreements, because these are interministerial, intergovernment agencies. But if you are looking at a broader perspective, signing agreements with, like ICTA or with China or Singapore, or to matter with Vietnam or any other small country, then this has to be open out, and that has to be discussed and with the private sector, especially looking at all the chamber, looking at trade organizations, professional organizations, which is happening at the moment. Because earlier it was a very grey area, we didn't know what is really happening, but now the documents are coming out, we are discussing it, we have certain windows that we can go to, which we are happy, but we are still not.
Discussions, Sujiva, took place when the Exchange Control Act also came into play.
Yes.
And then now there's a huge cry about this is not the act which the Business Committee envisaged. We had the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce former chairman Chandra Jayaratna writing a very strong letter to the Prime Minister, as well as the Minister of International Trade and Strategy, saying this is not what the people expected. Have a blueprint, have a white paper. It seems that the government is listening to you all, but they're going to implement something completely different. Is that healthy for a country's economy?
I don't really agree with you on that, because we had several discussions, myself, I think Ramal, we all went and met the Prime Minister and various other officials with regard to that. And with the change of ministerial positions, again, we had certain amendments done. So with regard to that, we can't be 100% agreeing, or the government cannot be 100% agreeing with the private sector, but we are, whatever the proposal we have done, actually the Ceylon Chamber was also involved in this proposal making, and I don't want to mention certain names, that they were in the forefront, and we actually got together as a joint chamber committee to fight and ask for our rights, which we think we have got 80% of what we wanted.
Thank you very much. Sujeva Samarveda, President of the National Chamber of Commerce. I now move my attention to Ramal Jaisinghe, President of the National Chamber of Exporters in Sri Lanka. Exports look quite healthy right now in Sri Lanka. You recorded very good growth in August. However, this is being somewhat ignored because of the imports that we're making right now to the country.
Yeah, that's correct.
2017, just less than 2 months to go. Where are we heading right now?
It's like this. I think the sector is doing well thanks to the boost with the GSP Plus and the change and a lot of attention being paid towards exports. Taking off from the discussion we had on trade agreements and the national export strategy or the trade policy, I must say I'm in the core team as being part of the chamber, and a lot of work has been done along with the World Trade Organization, right? And they use the consultants, and a lot of genuine steps have been taken to form a strategy. But again, the strategy has not funneled into sort of a plan. So that is where we are at right now, and I think next week there's a discussion, a further discussion with the core team. It is to be held, I think, on the 10th, I think, right, at Golf Face Hotel on what the points are. So I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago where particularly the Chinese and the Indian agreements were discussed, particularly with the free movement of personnel, anti-dumping, and I think in our case it would be the non-tariff barriers. So those were discussed at length, and we were given a margin of comfort by the new negotiating team that those have been duly addressed and they are going in depth. So we had an open discussion on that, and there were still certain gaps which are too many to express here, which again thankfully they are aware of it. So at least there's some enlightenment in the fact that they are aware of the realities. But again, how does it funnel down into a plan and into an action plan? I think that's where we are right now.
Ramal, I like your optimism with regard to this national trade policy, but there are many question marks with regard to policy. I'll tell you a classic example. We have the Cabinet Committee on Economic Management, and now we have another body which sits above this particular committee in question, that is the National Economic Council. Now, who do you all report to?
Now, the exactly a point. Now, I was with Subhashini about a week back on the consistency. We were talking the consistency of policies and the direction. Now, right now you have a vision 2025. Now, it would be in my simplistic mind that all these various strategies will funnel towards the objectives of vision 2025, and there will be a connect. So that is still not very clear to us. And then how do we develop an export market? The EDB has identified 7 industries as emerging markets where there is special attention being given, and among them is boat building and IT or ICT, where there will be some concessions and we are recognized those as emerging markets. But there is a much wider area that has to be addressed. And at the chamber we have given something like 28 budget proposals, which have been well thought of and thought through. So we are optimistic that at least this time they would look at it, and there are some budget proposals that were not implemented last year. So with all these together, hopefully the new budget, the expectation is that these would be addressed.
Your task must be really difficult, because you say many budget proposals were not implemented, and then you have more than 150, I think, proposals that were not implemented by the government. You just have a handful. Some people don't even know what these budget proposals are because of the manner in which this was presented. We saw the 2016 budget, 2015 budget. When I asked a few people, what did you gather from the budget, they say, please tell us, we want to know. That's the sort of budget that was presented in Sri Lanka the last 2 years. 2018, do we at least see a silver lining?
Well, hopefully we have gone through a learning process, right? Hopefully. And that we've learned and that we've come through, and okay, the frustration is rampant, right? So how do you address that? At least for us exporters, we are concerned about the incentives given on R&D, the incentives and the cessors that are done to make us evolve and meet international market standards. And there are some very valid incentives we have asked for and concessions. We are not asking for a free ride or a free run, but the whole effort should be towards promoting exports and not promoting imports. So that is where we come from essentially.
I think we must be the only country in Sri Lanka slapping a cess on our exports as well, Ramal. And this doesn't look healthy at all for a country like Sri Lanka.
Definitely, but I think playing devil's advocate is probably so that we are competitive or we compete at the same even playing field, but it's not an even playing field. Because for an entrepreneur, an exporter to reach those levels, there is a period of evolution. He's got to be producing, he's got to be opening markets, he's got to come up to that level, so you can't expect him to fly before he can even walk.
Thank you very much, Ramal Jasinghe, President of the National Chamber of Exporters. You said something very interesting about a learning curve for this government, and you hope and pray that at least they would have learned. But then again, the question is that at the cost of the people of Sri Lanka? So thank you very much, Ramal Jasinghe, President of the National Chamber of Exporters. I now move my attention to Ravi Ratnasabapathy, who is a fellow at Advocata Institute. Ravi, a lot of thoughts are being expressed that the country's economy is looking healthy. According to Sujiva, it's very optimistic. Ramal says there is no proper policy. This is not being funneled right to the bottom level or the grassroots. And what do you think? You think there's a silver lining, there's a light at the end of this tunnel? Are we still in the dark room trying to find where this door is? Where are we standing right now?
Right. But I'll just try to look at the macro situation. It's been a fairly tough year in terms of we've had a flood, we've had a drought that affected almost 2 million people. Given those constraints, the government revenues have the VAT and the other tax increases have really kicked in. The budget deficit, although it's still not in line, quite in line with the target, is pretty close to target. As a result, we've seen the exchange rate also stabilizing. We've seen the interest rates beginning to fall. Of course, inflation has been ticking up a bit, partly because of this of issues with floods, droughts issues, but also the tax increases working their way through. Exports, as Ramal said, has been a good bright spot. It's picking up strongly thanks to GSP Plus. Tourism, despite an airport closure, despite fears of dengue in the first part of the year, the small uptick there as well in numbers. So broadly, if we were to look at the macro situation, it is satisfactory given the circumstances.
But there's
no,
a but, yes.
Yes. If you look at it from the consumer's or a citizen's perspective, that stability in the macro picture has come because the government has been collecting a lot more tax. What they did earlier was they spent money which they did not have, and then they printed it to meet the requirement. The currency depreciated, everybody paid the price, or you went and borrowed it at excessive rates and spent, and your debt kept going up. Now what has happened is the government is able to fund most of its expenditure within a reasonable limit of the budget deficit through taxation. But what is happening to consumers is that they are paying a lot more tax, so they are feeling a lot poorer.
Right, Ravi, I'm going to
Yes.
pose a very quick question to you before your time runs out. You bring a very optimistic picture about the country's macroeconomic situation. You said that the reserves are doing well right now. Exports are quite healthy,
Yes.
and things are looking not bad for the country. But I want to drag your attention to the private sector of this country. The top line growth of most companies end of the second quarter looks very, very grim. The bottom levels, the top line, there is a decline. The bottom line, there is no growth whatsoever. They are scraping right now. They're scraping the little bit that they have, the private sector. And when you're saying the country's economy is doing well, where is that reflection in the pocket of an ordinary citizen of Sri Lanka?
Yeah. What you're seeing basically is the effect of the fiscal tightening. The taxes have gone up, consumer spending has dropped, the government finances have improved, right?
Ravi, did you know that most blue chip companies who were supposed to give increments to their workforce in this quarter have stopped it because of problems in the top lines? Are you aware of it?
No, I wasn't aware of that, but it is inevitable once you have the squeeze on the fiscal side, people have to pay more.
And then you have a government
tax.
who goes against all these principles and gives a 10,000 rupee increment to the state sector employees last year. Is that a sensible move?
Well, that is what happened last year, and that wasn't a good move, and that is why we have a lot of problems today. But as of this year, the government has been managing things far more responsibly. The new finance ministry is actually looking to cut expenditure. Now, you can't immediately translate this into benefits to citizens. It's going to take time to work through. But the government can, if they can manage and to reduce the expenditure, reduce the waste, reduce the corruption. A lot of this is taking place within the state-owned enterprises. If you can get rid of some of those and those savings be passed on to consumers in the form of lower taxes, that would be a, you still can't mess around with the budget. Your debt is 79% of...
You said that it takes time.
Yes.
How long must the people of Sri Lanka tighten their belts further? How long will it take?
It's going to take a couple of years possibly before the results start coming through.
And when that happens, there won't be this government in power maybe. Thank you very much, Ravi Ratnasarapati, Fellow of the Advocata Institute, for joining us this evening as well. Right. I now move my attention to the lady in the panel, Subhashini Abhisingh, Research Director, Verite Research. I want to drag your attention, Subhashini, to state-owned enterprises that Ravi clearly articulated. I want to drag your attention to the $1.5 billion IMF loan against one of our loss-making state-owned enterprises, Sri Lankan Airlines. The accumulated losses of Sri Lankan Airlines stands alone at $1 billion US dollars, which is approximately around 170 billion Sri Lankan rupees. 1.5 billion against 1 billion, you pay off that debt off, you are only left with another 500 million or so. Is this the way to go? What must we do with our state-owned enterprises? Mustn't we start strategically looking at all these state SOEs and start looking at it afresh? The time starts now.
So anyway, reforming state-owned enterprises, every government finds it very challenging because of political reasons. Generally in Sri Lanka, perceptions about reforming government agencies, also especially getting private sector involved, is not very, people are not very positive about such reforms. In Sri Lanka, you need to understand people still believe, despite continuously government failing to run these enterprises profitably, people still somehow seem to think these enterprises being with the government is better than giving it to private sector, especially if it is given to international private sector. So this is any government struggles with this issue of making these state enterprises reform process politically feasible. And the governments are naturally very concerned about their popularity, and especially for a government right now that is looking for 3 years of elections. We are looking at maybe 4 elections. If you add a referendum, 5 elections. Any government going in for elections is very, very careful, cautious about undertaking any reform, any initiative that the public generally would perceive negatively. So I think whether it's Sri Lankan Airlines or any other state-owned enterprise, this is an issue. What successive governments have failed to do, of course, is educating the public about the need to reform these enterprises and need to let go of some of these enterprises from government control. I think we've done a very poor job in terms of communicating to the people that their tax money can be better utilized to serve them rather than to run a loss-making state-owned
Subhashini, they're
enterprises.
trying to sell off Sri Lankan Airlines. No one is willing to buy this white elephant at the moment. Even the president has made a plea from the Qatari government as well to relook at the negotiations that took place several months ago. And I think the president is trying to say, please take it off. We'll even give it to you free. I think that's the thinking that is going on right now in the government. They don't want Sri Lankan Airlines anymore. But the point is, does the government have a vision? Now, you are very clearly articulating the fact that there are going to be 3 elections and 1 referendum. Thank you for that news, by the way. I hope and pray that is right. There is no optimism at all in that. But the bad news for Sri Lankans is that we are continuing to pay these enterprises. Is that the way to go? What can we do as a country?
So state-owned enterprise reform is definitely something that has been on the agenda for a number of governments, but they have not been able to deliver simply because it was partly politically not feasible, and partly, like you said, some enterprises are run down to a level where no investor would want to invest it, because any investor would want to put money in a place where they can have returns. So to be very honest, I do not see state-owned enterprise reform to be a big agenda going forward in the next 3 years.
Subhashini, I'm going to pose a question from you. Who's at fault? The previous government or this government?
I think it's every successive government. So state-owned enterprise reform, or the way we have run our state-owned enterprises, is not the fault of a single government, because state-owned enterprises have existed for decades. And every year, it's not just today or last year that we've been making losses in these enterprises. It has happened for decades. But we had certain room for managing or sustaining these enterprises at a time where we had access to concessional loans, where we had other types of finances. But today, what you see is Sri Lanka going in for a middle-income economy with a falling government revenue. So basically, as a percentage of GDP, government revenue has been falling since about 2000, from around 18% to reach 13%. And Sri Lanka is one of the middle-income countries that has lowest shares of revenue as a percentage of GDP. At a time like this, we don't have the luxury of running these enterprises, and it's becoming increasingly more difficult, which pushes governments to make hard decisions.
With your permission, I'm going to rephrase my question once again that I posed to you. You said every successive government is responsible. So since 1994, it has been the UPFA government in power until 2015, minus 2 years from 2001 to 2003. So my question now to you is, so the UPFA government is largely responsible for the loss-making entity, which is Sri Lankan Airlines.
Yes, I mean, definitely the decisions that were made in terms of management and the way it was run down, definitely it is a responsibility, because previously it was with the private sector.
Thank you very much for this question. Just to shed some light as to what Subhashini just mentioned to us, in 2001, 18th of November, the Sri Lankan Airlines liabilities exceeded assets by rupees 3.7 billion, and EY, which was doing its audit report that year, said that the company will not be able to be declared as a going concern. And that same issue cropped up again a few months ago, where the Minister of State Enterprise Development, Kabir Hashim, said that he is very unfortunate that he has to declare Sri Lankan Airlines once again as a going concern, which means that you at home would be continuing to pay your tax money on a loss-making state enterprise. So let's open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate left is Zulfikar Farzan, who is a senior producer attached to Newsfirst. And on to my far left is Chaturang Haporachi, known face on Face the Nation. So let's start off tonight's show with Zulfikar Farzan.
Thanks, Sham. My question goes first to Mrs. Subhashini. It's relating to the budget. Now there is how would I phrase it? People believe that the budget of any government of any year will be some sort of relief to them. But when you look at the budget document, it's always the expenditure is far greater than the revenue. So can the people believe that the budget is actually going to give benefits to them?
So first point I would like to make is the people's expectations from a budget in terms of concessions and relief is not really an accurate expectation, partly because budgets have a far bigger role to play than just giving handouts or subsidies. So a budget is basically Sri Lanka's how the government would spend its revenue, which is around nearly 2 trillion rupees of revenue that is collected from taxes to the development of the country. And this includes from building roads to building hospitals to building educations to improving ports to. So it actually encompasses a large array of development activities, and subsidies or salary hikes are actually a very minor part in it. But unfortunately, the public understanding or the expectation largely is concentrated around the expectation of will the government servants get salary hikes? Will our pensions be increased? Or will the fuel subsidy be increased? So this is also a challenge for the government, because this is why, like previously mentioned, governments are forced to give sometimes, especially if they're heading for elections like what happened in 2015, meet these short-term expectations of the public. Because if you're thinking of building a highway to building a port to building hospitals or improving education, those do not necessarily give returns within a 5-year election cycle. So that's a constant challenge in our budgeting process, and as a result we have consistently moved to give these short-term relief measures that really does not generate sustainable growth for the country, and it escalates expenditure, and basically we have all these higher fiscal deficits and other macroeconomic problems arising from that.
So what sort of remedial measures should the government adopt?
So ideally the government should think medium to long term and be bold enough to take decisions immaterial of those decisions not delivering results in the next 6 months. But like I said, every government struggles when they are presenting a budget with the political objective, balancing the political objectives with economic realities. So most of the time, unfortunately, every government prioritizes the political objectives over economic, and that is why we end up with all these macroeconomic problems.
Sujeev, I want to ask a question from you as well. Now, you are in the business, as they call it. Now, we spoke about the decisions that the government takes. Now, even when you carry out a certain transaction with someone, you would always have a contingency, a plan B. But if you take a look at the actions of the government in the recent past, now, right now as we speak, we are waiting for a ship to come. A decision taken by the government that went wrong. I think the previous time we were waiting so eagerly for a ship was when Sangamitta arrived with, that sort of thing. So, does the government take decisions and not have a contingency plan, or how do you see this?
No, actually, we see, if you take the oil crisis, yes, we need to plan ourselves. In the private sector, we are used to plan. Not only for this year, we used to have a 5-year plan. And any government should have at least a short-term plan for 3 years, and then how they're going to drive it for the next 3 years. Some of the organizations, I must very frankly say that they have this 5-year plan. And some of the monitoring aspects are also taking place presently. But, when you really look at some of the administration issues that we have in this country, I beg to agree with you that, some decisions, some kind of decision makers are not in a position to strategize themselves in order to make, things available, or to have a kind of a move to make forward your plans are active. This is a very, very clear kind of example where the oil issues are concerned, maybe the harvesting issues are concerned when we import rice. it goes back to food, fuel. I mean, those are hard decisions to take, but then with so much of years experience as government officials have, they have to have some kind of concrete solution for the issues that are taking place. Having said that, I must also tell you on the income, the expenditure side of the government. Now I know especially there is a new innovation within the government to have KPIs to government officials, which is a very great initiative taken by this government, which no one has taken. So there we are, the first year is all gone, but the next year onwards the people in the government sector will get used to work for KPIs. The second most important thing what I see from the private sector perspective is cutting down costs, and we have this committees which comprise of opposition members having been looked into these cluster ministries as they call, to see whether there is duplication of work, whether there is any sort of malpractices within, and those are controlled by the opposition members. So not merely criticizing the government in many ways, opening it out for social aspects, but they must also look at the administration aspects of it. There is a role for the opposition member also to play in order to question the ruling party, officials plus the politicians, to why certain things are not happening. So to answer your question, yes, we need to have a strategic plan, and the government should be very clear in implementing those. As Ramal very clearly said, we find certain loopholes where it is not integrated. Those links, the chains have not been tightened properly. So there are loose ends which sort of falls apart. And that is where we need to strengthen.
Ravi, I want to ask a question from you as well regarding the budget and how things have been progressed. As we discussed earlier, we saw how the two previous budgets were read out. Once they were read out to the public, really the general public did not have a proper clue as to what was happening. Maybe a few individuals who were closely following it had a clear idea, but vast majority general public did not have a clear idea. So when it comes to all of these allocations, the exorbitant allocations that are made to various ministries, whether they are needed or not needed is a matter that should be discussed. But when there are various vast allocations made, do we have the reserves to make allocations like that to the ministries? And then how do we check back again and see, has the ministry done what it was supposed to do, when we don't have a mechanism, or when we don't have an audit act operating in our country?
Right. Very, very good and very relevant question. We need to ask ourselves what we really expect a government to do. Right? The government needs to prioritize its spending. We are in a society that is aging. Is our healthcare system geared to cater to an aging society? It was set up in a young developing country catering to primary care. Now you are a middle income country getting old. We are getting old because before we are getting rich. Do we have the resources to treat Alzheimer's, dementia, heart disease, cancer, the diseases that go along with a maturing population? This is a fundamental question you need to ask yourself. The second is the big risk area is natural disasters. Last year we were hit by two, a drought and a flood. Do we have the contingency plans? It needs to be insurance based plans, because if you have to government going to bail out citizens every time it goes into a disaster, you're going to blow a big hole in the budget. So you need to plan, you need to so now these are just examples of how we would like to see a government prioritize its expenditure. Now, do you need to be running retail stores? Right? There's Cargies, there's Keels, there's some very good supermarkets. Do you need a Satosa? Is that a priority for the government to run? Is it a priority for the government to run an airline? Right? Find out what your real priorities are, and then allocate accordingly.
Previous government saw fit to start up a new airlines like Lanka. So when you take a look at what that government did and what we are seeing now, this government seems to, have things together, but also at the same time not have things together.
Right. Yeah. So what well, it's something that we need to keep asking the questions and then try to bring the government in. What needs to happen is you need to have spending priorities, then you need to have performance indicators to see how your spending is being delivered. In the case of the hospitals, how many patients are they treating? What is the cost of the treatment? How many people are they servicing? How much of your rupees that they take from you in tax is coming back to you in services of value? A lot of it is getting lost in waste. A lot of it is getting lost in corruption. That should not happen. Let the state focus on what it sees as a priority. The areas where the individual citizens acting on their own can't cover, the common services, let everything else be handled by the citizen. No longer are roads considered common services. You can have toll roads developed privately. You don't need to incur the debt. You just have a clear, clean, open auction process to set up and get the construction built by a private sector. You don't need to incur the debt. You don't need to incur the cost of management. Just auction it off, but do it transparently and openly.
Ms. Abesing, a question to you as well. Now, when you take a look at all the statements made by the Prime Minister during the past month or so, we would hear common phrases being used all the time. The debt that was incurred, the debt that was incurred, we are going to have to take more loans to repay the debt that was taken, and things like that. And also, in the same speech, we would hear investment coming in, there are investments coming in. Is this the real case? For you, as a person who would research the market, can you say that there are investments coming into our country? And if so, where is that money?
So Sri Lanka's foreign direct investments have definitely are not performing to the expected levels. The maximum we have got for a year is like 1.5 billion US dollars, which is very, very small, which is about 1 to 1.5% of our GDP compared to other countries in the region that is really receiving much higher levels of foreign direct investment. This has been one area where the country has been struggling, and until 2009 we had an excuse. This was all because of the security reasons, because we have a war, because people are scared. And everyone expected once this risk elements associated with security was taken off, that foreign investments will flow into the country. But the reality is far from it, right? Today we are struggling even to reach 1 billion US dollars of investment a year. And this is largely because we do not have the systems and the processes in place to attract FDI. When an investor comes into the country, they want to know, they don't want to be sent from post to pillar. They don't want different officers to give 10 different interpretations about the current regulations.
Consistency of policy.
Exactly, and not only policy, institutional framework. We have been talking about this one-stop shop. Yes. So Board of Investment was supposed to be a one-stop shop, where when an investor goes in there, they would be facilitated with all the government approvals necessary. But in reality, it has not delivered. And what we need to understand is Sri Lanka is not the only country that an investor has to invest in. So an investor would look at a large number of countries in the region, and they would obviously go to a country where the business environment is a lot more facilitating, especially because Sri Lanka has very little to offer in terms of markets like India. For example, even if India's institutions and regulations are not that facilitating, you're talking about entering into a 1.2 billion people market, and investors are willing to take that risk. Whereas Sri Lanka, it's only a 20 million market. So we always say in economics terms, like investments that seek markets would not find Sri Lanka attractive, nor do investments that seek resources. Like Bangladesh would attract investments because they have large labor pool that is relatively low cost. Sri Lanka does not have the resources to attract investments as well. So only investments that will come to the country are efficiency-seeking investments who look at doing business in Sri Lanka and also from Sri Lanka with the Indian subcontinent faster and easier, and this is where we have really not delivered.
Rama, right now Subhashini brings out a point that the BOI was supposed to be a one-stop shop, but right now we're not even seeing that. In terms of exporters in Sri Lanka, what are the challenges the exporters are facing right now? Where is the government mechanism coming into play?
Actually, one of
is
the
there
things,
government support anywhere around the corner as far as exports are concerned?
It's the same thing that Subhashini just highlighted on this one-stop shop concept. Now, if I were to export something, I got to go through 3 different or 4 different authorities to get my goods across. Now, we are an agro-based, essentially an agro-based economy. Now, say if I'm doing something like floriculture or horticulture, I got to go to 3 different authorities just to get something to do with my plants approved, and then only get about exporting. So that takes time. Now, if I have a market in Holland or Amsterdam or someplace like that, I'm in that essence of time because of the red tape here. Whereas if it is something to do with, if I go to a one-stop shop like the agro department where everything is done and it's gone through, so we lack that sort of infrastructural support. I think the message here is the infrastructure and a system where you facilitate exporters. I took this one step further, the recent, and that is one of the proposals we had. I mean, if we are to develop an export entrepreneur model, where if I am into some sort of hobby and I need to send something, or if I can manufacture some small component, I use a gateway like PayPal, and I mean from my home I become an exporter. Now, do we have that sort of infrastructure in place? I think these are the things that we need to develop from a high end right down to a low end. Take the handicraft manufacturers in Hikkaduwa. The only market is, I mean, trying to ply their goods on the beach, right? But what sort of organized, we have an authority for that, but where does it take them? Because we are, I'm sure if you go to Europe or any other similar market, there are so many opportunities. So I think...
But when it comes to organizations, let's talk about tea exports. Right now we're talking about less than $1.5 billion US market for the tea industry in Sri Lanka. When you want to open up the market, liberalize the country's tea exports and make it a $5 billion industry, many individuals say no to this, and there's a political tug of war. If you read the papers, every single week you have the Tea Export Association hammering the tea board hammering the Tea Export Association and the former chairman and so on and so forth. There is a huge problem with individual companies. As an export-oriented body, do you think that we have to open up and liberalize the tea industry in Sri Lanka, make it, because we're talking about less than 300 million kilos a year against 5.2 billion in the world market?
Let me address it like this. I think the tea industry is like a double-edged sword, right? On one end, there's a sector that asks for opening up so that you can blend and export to certain markets. Then there's another school of thought that the purity of the Ceylon tea needs to be maintained and its integrity. Now, where do you strike the balance? I think that is where somebody needs to come in and see what really is the strategy for tea exports. And I think this goes down into the branding of Sri Lanka. Now, is it Sri Lanka tea or Ceylon tea? Is it Ceylon tourism or Sri Lanka tourism? So, we are aware, right, that there has been 1 billion rupees allocated from the 2016 or 2015 budget for branding, which has not been touched so far.
There's 5.2 billion rupees in the promotional budget of the tea board for tea exporters. Right. Has it been utilized? The answer is no.
So what are we doing? So it is on one side, okay, you can't blame the government has given that allocation. What have we done about it? That's supposed to be spent.
Ramal, because every exporter, when they're sending a kilo of tea overseas, are contributing to this particular fund in question.
Exactly.
Are they getting benefited? The answer is no again. Do we really have a school of thought, okay, this is where we want to go in terms of our exports? That's the point. Do we have a vision for Sri Lanka?
Now, it boils down back to leadership, right? I mean, you take any organization, right? I can speak for the private sector. The progress of that particular organization depends on its leadership. So somebody's got to really take, okay, like probably what they did way back in 1977. I mean, we, from a very closed setup, we went to an open, anything goes sort of situation, right? And I mean, that was the precursor. I mean, that started, and it did fairly well, I think, for that time. So do we have that sort of leadership? Right? The challenge is to have that sort of leadership, that sort of decision making and risk taking. There's a lot of risk that we need to take. Of course, the situation in 77 and the global situation in 2017 or 2018 is far different. But of course, we have the luxury of knowledge being without boundaries. You have a young talent pool, a thought pool. Now, one of the things that we thought would be a very good private-public partnership is, along with the EDB, we set up a think tank for branding. And being in that committee, I suggested that we have the university system and the marketing professionals to get together and form or assist in the branding exercise. So there was a lot of commitment, a lot of work went into it, but okay, this started in May, and still I don't know what the results are. So this is getting the best marketing brains into the system. Whereas in other countries, from what I gather, you have the academics, the professionals and the private sector working together towards a common goal. Now here do we have a common goal?
It's because of politics that we are not getting any breakthrough. Let's talk about tea again. We had the Minister of Plantation who initially said for 3 years, yes, we are still open up for discussion with regard to opening up Sri Lanka, having a tea hub. In Hambantota, there was discussion afoot. And then a few months back, the Minister of Plantations, who is hailing from Nureli, who has a majority voter base in that particular region, comes and says, no, we have closed down the door, no liberalization is going to be discussed. Where are we really heading, Ramal? Is this the future? Do we really have a future? In the next few years, there won't be tea pluckers in Sri Lanka anymore. Then what's going to happen to this brand, Ceylon tea? You go to, I was in China just a couple of days back. I see London-based tea companies are saying pure Ceylon tea and trying to sell Sri Lankan tea or a mix of every origin of tea for a higher price. And where does Sri Lankans stand? Right at the bottom of the shelf. We don't have that capability, unfortunately. Is this the future that we're looking at?
I think this is a marketing problem, right? Okay, we are on one side trying to look at policy, but then how do you market or maintain your niche? I think as much as tea, the same goes for cinnamon. Now there is a substitute called cassia, I think, that is masquerading as cinnamon, and which is supposed to be carcinogenic. But we have the best cinnamon in the world. So we have in our proposals given a whole lot of infrastructural suggestions where you can make a niche, going down to even professionalizing the cinnamon peeler or the professional, so that you maintain some sort of dignity, because the generations to come will not want to do it as the way.
But Mr. Jasing, what happens is, yes, institutions like yours, private companies, lots of people get together and put forward the ideas. They formulate a system as to how to do it, but it goes up the ladder and hits the ceiling where some minister takes another completely different solution or a different way to look at it, just because he and a few of his friends are getting a benefit out of it, and the whole system collapses on itself again. That is what we have seen. So don't you think the effort put in by the private organizations, individuals like you, will go to waste when that happens?
No, but that is the challenge we have as private sector leaders and as chambers. I think the more awareness, the more programs like this that you have, I mean, I don't think even an electorate, right? I mean, you got to retain the electorate at all costs, right? But again, what you call good sense should prevail at some point in time, because ultimately it's not just one person or a group of people. I mean, all of us suffer. So I think, in fairness, at least with the forums I have been, people are listening. Now there may be politics and other details where they might have to grapple, or other challenges that they might have to sort. So amongst them, if they have a closer connection with those captains of industry, with the chambers, and I think that is happening, Sujeev, even to some extent, I think we might hopefully see the light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, the tunnel is pretty far, right? The light, but nonetheless, we should be. I think at least there's light.
Right now, Ramal and Subhashini, Sujiva, as well as Ravi, what the people are seeing is a sheer mirage. They're still running for something elusive. Whether they grapple it is about time. We have to wait and see what exactly happens and transpires. We go in for a short commercial break, and then we compare the 2018 appropriation bill that was tabled against 2017 and the 2016 budget. You want some surprises? We'll give you the analysis of what happened. All that and more after this short commercial break. Trust me, it's full of surprises. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back.